The most overused, undervalued word in the English language, next to awesome, is the word iconic. You know, something revered or idolized. Companies would like you to believe that everything they make is iconic. Toothpaste, ketchup. But we know better. In this episode of El Camino, we bring you a pair of truly iconic motorcycles.
El Camino is brought to you by Yamaha. Revs your heart. Scott Sports. No shortcuts. Best Western Hotels and Resorts.
Welcome to El Camino. I'm Neil Graham. Every company hopes their new motorcycle is going to be a success, obviously. But what is success? Making your manager happy? Good reviews in the press, strong sales. All three are significant, but everyone that makes a new bike dreams of a magic fourth element, that a motorcycle becomes iconic, revered as more than just an object, more than a machine. In the way Picasso's Guernica is more than just a painting, the Parthenon more than a building, and King Tut's tomb more than a crawl space stuffed with knickknacks. But here's the rub. There isn't a formula for making something iconic. You can't plan for it, budget for it, or will it into being. In the 1960s in Italy, a handful of 20-something employees working for an industrialist embarked on a secret project. They kept it from their bosses. Not a word was ever spoken about it in the lunchroom. But they gained the trust of the night watchman, and on their own time, they built something special. Eventually, the project was embraced by bosses and became known by one word: Miura, the most beautiful car ever made. Who could have guessed this outcome? Well, nobody. Those kids that made the Miura could just as easily have been fired for insubordination. Now, on the other hand, the Victory Motorcycle Company, rest in peace, teased for years an upcoming bike that they said was going to be iconic. They were absolutely convinced. They wouldn't stop talking about it. The name of that motorcycle? The Victory Vision. Moving on. What makes something iconic? If it was straightforward to define, it would be straightforward to achieve, but it's not. In fact, iconic vehicles contain contradiction. They're often revolutionary, but humans don't like too much change, so we often reject what's unfamiliar. Unless it's just so good that we can't help ourselves. Honda's Goldwing, when it appeared, was an oddity, a bike built for touring. Nobody done that. But it was so good. Sticking with Honda, the CB750. Again, shocking. Shockingly good. Sometimes it takes time for a bike to gain hallowed status, like when the Vincent Black Shadow became the fastest bike in the world, or when Honda made its 100 millionth Super Cub. Former Yamaha designer Michael Ullrich, who in episode 2 from this season of El Camino took us through the process of how a motorcycle is developed, is back to tell us about a machine that became iconic the very moment our eyes first fell upon it.
So this is a Ducati 916. It's very well regarded as one of the most beautiful motorcycles ever made. It's certainly a game changer in terms of how motorcycles were designed. Let me elaborate. So this is a 7-year-long project. This was begun in the late 1980s. The idea was to create a street bike that would be the ultimate street bike, I'm quoting the owner of the company at the time, the Ferrari of motorcycles. And the designer, Massimo Tamburini, was a self-taught man. He had actually been a duct installer and had done some basic welding as a career for 25 years at that point. And this project was modeled entirely in plaster, which was the tradition in Italy at the time. Sheets of plaster that were used to do basically what we would consider drywalling, except without the paper. So plaster boards would be cut and sandwiched by hand and then shaved and formed with wet plaster. So there are only a few handful of photographs of the designer working on this bike. And he's always in a white coverall covered in white dust, cigarette in his mouth, and a block of sandpaper, and he's sanding. What makes this bike special from a design standpoint is there is before 916 and there's after 916. This and the Suzuki Katana, the 1983 Katana, really did more to move motorcycle design than probably any other bike. But the real breakthrough here is size. Sport bikes at this time looked like tree trunks. They were really wide because they were 4-cylinder Japanese things. This is so narrow, and it's narrow across the waist, which causes these curves to accelerate out on the tail and on the tank. And they're just beautiful. You want to touch them. I mean, every transition is thoughtful. There are little things which I've gushed about since I was a design student, not least of which is this. That's one continuous line. And that's not easy to do. This is a positive surface that makes a 90-degree bend to go inside. This surface bends out. This line that unifies these vents and are highlighted by this little undercut, this little shadow, all of them on the same angle. That's very hard to do. It looks easy. It looks like something you could just quickly throw in with a pencil. But when you get into modeling, and you actually have to create this in 3 dimensions, and you don't want it, this surface can't stick out too much, but you need it to, this part has to be inside of that surface. That's just time. And that's the difference between good design and not good design. It's not genius, it's time. You're looking at 7 years of thoughtful contemplation. My favorite part on this bike is the headlight cup. It's a magnesium casting. It's almost completely invisible. It's bolted to 2 other castings, these antenna-like castings which hold the mirrors and support the fairing. Before this motorcycle, this whole front assembly was held on by what was unaffectionately known as the bird cage, which were just bent and welded tubes. On Japanese motorcycles, the same vintage, there's tubes go through here, and they come over here and they bolt down or weld it into the frame, and there's a crossbar, and everyone sort of liked it. It was like, oh, it's racing. It looks very purposeful. Ducati spent a lot of money and a lot of time to clean this area up. So that casting is beautiful, it's functional, it's lightweight, it's an absolutely, in my view, beautiful object on its own. And it's been thoughtfully designed, even though it's almost completely hidden. The triple clamp, again, until this time, was just seen as, well, it's an aluminum part that holds the forks to the steering tube. Usually there was a really ugly key barrel. And at most, a mass market bike would have some superficial slot or line. This has been cleaned up completely. They moved the cylinder barrel back here so that you have a completely clean and unobstructed view of the cockpit. There's enough of the frame and the motor visible to sort of tease what's inside. It's not brashly showing off. You look at the size of my engine, but it's there, you can see it, and there's enough light in between these spaces to make it feel lightweight, and it is, for its time, very lightweight. And the last little thing that I'll share is this brake light is from a Honda moped. And it was homologated, which means the rules specifically say so many square centimeters of surface area have to be visible at a certain angle for it to be legal. Now that light was homologated by itself for use on a scooter at an angle much steeper than this, and including the surface between the 2 lenses. But Ducati just put this body panel through it, and therefore this is legal in the sort of the letter of the law, but not in the spirit of the law. And I just love that they just didn't care. And it's become a signature piece of this motorcycle ever since. I think it's beautiful from every angle.
This segment is brought to you by Dainese, 75 years of performance.
This is the end of the era of when a small company could make limited numbers of motorcycles, and they could do it because they could just go and buy a lot of the motorcycle out of a catalog. You know, you could buy lights and mirrors. Now those are bespoke mirrors, actually. This bike has a lot of bespoke parts. The headlights are bespoke. But at the tail light, it was just, look, we've got like 11 euros left, you know. Put a tail light on it. But you know, this is expensive. Like, this is really expensive. And this, moving the key cylinder down there, that's not a small task. And then the whole resolution of it, I mean, that one movement, this is led by design, and it caused a lot of headaches for a lot of people. And the result is something that is, you know, most people don't notice, but on some intuitive level, when they look at this feels expensive and finished and designed, and a Fireblade, which is a, if I may say, superior product in almost every sense, feels cheaper because there's a bird cage here, and there's an ugly triple clamp, and a big ugly Honda, you know, with the start, like lettering from 1983, which they never changed for 30 years, like sitting there, and the ugly lights that they also just carried over from like a 1982 Nighthawk. This little aluminum turned cap holding this cup on, that's, you know, 45 cents, but it makes a difference. The Ducati Monster saved Ducati, but the 916 made Ducati. To a Ducatista, there's this long-winded explanation, but the world is not made of enthusiasts. There was no Ducati before this motorcycle to the general public. This is the motorcycle the general public in the 90s became aware of, this small Italian motorcycle company. This is the bike that got the attention of Texas Pacific Group, who acquired it in 95 or 6. And this is the bike that made sport bikes kind of bougie. Before that, it was the, you know, I mean, sport motorcycles were not a city thing. They were a kid in the country got a sport bike. You know, you look at the heroes of motorcycle racing throughout the 80s and 70s, they were usually working class, usually from small towns or suburbs. This became the banker's motorcycle, the only one alternative to Harley Davidson. Prestige, motorcycle as a lifestyle statement. Because it communicates all those things immediately to everybody. I am incredibly special. I'm incredibly expensive. It takes a lot of skill to master me. That's what this bike says. And it's, you know, as you said, you know, 110 horsepower or something, you know. A GSXR of its vintage, a 750 GSXR, would outrun it on any track in the world and costs half as much. But those bikes are free now. If you find one that isn't wrecked. And these bikes command amazing prices and are desired. The success of a motorcycle design is not the sum of its sales. It's the sales plus its impact on the culture. You know, these are not commodities.
This segment is brought to you by Yamaha. Revs your heart.
The 916 is one of the greatest motorcycles. It's incontestable, and given that motorcycles have been around for well over 100 years, the list of iconic bikes is substantial. Gold Star, Bonneville, Electroglide, Katana, and that Black Shadow. But I've always loved the underdog, and rooting for bikes like the Manx Norton or Moto Guzzi Le Mans is a little like cheering for the best-looking cheerleader. They don't need more attention. So what are the below-the-radar bikes? The ones we don't think of when we think about significant motorcycles? Michael said it. They're the motorcycles that impact the culture, and no motorcycle has had more influence on the culture within motorcycling, but also outside of it, than the chopper. Your Shadow or Virago or Vulcan or Rebel would not exist without the chopper. And you can even make a compelling argument that Harley-Davidson itself wouldn't exist today had it not been for the chopper. Harley-Davidson without doing anything, became the maker of the bike most chopped. And then Harley caught on and began to make machines that looked like choppers, while at the same time distancing itself from outlaw motorcycle clubs who became the most visible chopper riders on the road. It was a delicate balance, but Harley mostly pulled it off, selling its motorcycles to those who broke the law and to the police who upheld the law. Now that's brilliant. The history of the chopper is tied to World War II. When servicemen returned to the US from overseas, they had challenges reintegrating into society. Today, many of those men would be diagnosed with PTSD. But in the 1940s, people just said you were a little wild. And if riding helps me work my way through my benign issues, well, these guys had way more going on. And a stock Harley, the same bikes the cops used, was just a little too meek for these guys. So these ex-servicemen pulled parts off and turned their bikes into stripped down, lean, noisy, unsafe, and uncivilized motorcycles. And this is what they got.
This segment is brought to you by Best Western Hotels and Resorts.
Now this bike didn't start off looking like this. It looked more like this. But once Jason Parker worked his magic, oh, he's not angry here, I'm just gobbling up his time, it became a note-perfect post-war chopper. Jason says he's always loved biker B movies and the old stuff, the purest stuff, before greasy long hair and hippies got on the scene. Parker's got a point. Earliest is usually always best. The chopper, especially after the movie Easy Rider in 1969, just got goofy. Forks grew as long as a stepladder as high, and the bikes became symbols of rebellion more than vehicles on which to rebel. Now there's a difference, an important difference. Parker's orange chopper is a usable, visceral motorcycle. It's relatively light, and its 1958 Harley panhead engine has been massaged so that it'll boogie the 1957 frame down the road with surprising vigor. And it's beautiful. The best looking American motorcycle, hands down. But why? Purity. Parker's chopper is as true as a Bill Monroe bluegrass ballad or a Hank Williams heartbreaker. And unlike the 916, it isn't styled. It's a process of addition through subtraction. It's an engine, a pair of wheels, and well, that's just about it. Let's go through it. The 21-inch front wheel is a prerequisite. So is a skinny tire. Parker's chopper has a front brake, but a lot of the early choppers didn't. Slowing was never as much of a concern for early riders as going. Next, the fork. It's from 1942, and the fender, well, there's no fender. Mud, rain, come on, toughen up. Next, the engine. Harley engines from this era are nicknamed panheads because the cover on the top of the cylinders looks like a pan, like a frying pan, that you could remove, flip over, put on a camp stove, drizzle with olive oil and just a touch of balsamic vinaigrette, and saute Brussels sprouts. I really love Brussels sprouts. Panheads are beautiful engines. The narrow 45 degrees between the cylinders tightly fills the compact frame. It's as tight in that engine bay as a New York City closet. And note how the top frame rail follows the angle of the rear cylinder head and how close it is to the frame. Too tight even for a slice of thin crust pizza to slide through. On the subject of line and symmetry, look at those exhaust pipes and how perfectly the bottom pipe echoes the angle of the lower frame rail. If it was off, even just a bit off, my teeth would ache. And because there's no rear suspension, the ribbed rear fender hugs the tire as tightly as the engine fits in the frame. Call it creative tension. And in those mufflers that don't really muffle, I see a cocktail shaker. Really, I do. And the rear tire is skinny jeans skinny. Nothing on this bike is about bulk. It's about lean muscle. Harleys, stock Harleys, and American bikes in general, prioritize size. They're gleefully overweight. After all, Harley makes a bike called the Fat Boy, whereas this bike is the skinny puppy. And the details, the trident on the sissy bar, the diminutive seat, the lack of turn signals, gauges, or rear view mirrors. That when you're on the bike, it feels like you're straddling an engine and that's it. Even the gear shifting makes no allowance for mistakes. It has a foot clutch, like a car, or how cars used to be, and the shifter is a lever below and to the left of your hind end. Can't find neutral? You'd better hope you don't lean to the left at a stoplight and need to put a foot down, or you'll release the clutch and find yourself in a world of trouble as the bike shoots across 4 lanes of traffic. I'm not a chopper guy. I never watched the chopper TV shows, and I've never had the urge to join an outlaw motorcycle club. I'm just not that angry, or not that angry enough. But Parker's chopper, in its unsanitized glory, makes me want to do terrible things, like ride 50 in a 40 zone, or get a tattoo, a neck tattoo, of a skull with flames and little red eyes. Maybe I'll think that one through. Every motorcycle has a place where it's at home. The 916 longs for its homeland, for a hard ride through the Stelvio Pass, then a hop across the border for a night in Switzerland, say St. Moritz. Parker's chopper is a different animal, at home in more modest surroundings, say outside a tavern late on a Saturday night, its chrome turned the red and blue of neon, or alongside a set of railroad tracks, next to the deep thudding of a locomotive hauling an endless line of groaning, clanking rail cars. A chopper is brash and loud and right in your face. A chopper is America. Thank you for watching El Camino.
Clothing was provided by Importations Tebow, service you can trust. El Camino was brought to you by the Motorcycle Super Show, the big one by the airport. Dainese, 75 years of performance. Hudson Henderson, your insurance provider for motorcycle, power sports, and marine.